journey began on October 21st, 1931.
I name these the American Clipper. There you are.
Mrs. Herbert Hoover, assisted by Pan Am's president, Juan Trippe, christened the American Clipper a Sikorsky S-40, the first plane to be called a Pan American Clipper. S-40 was not transoceanic, but it was an innovative design. Charles Lindbergh, technical advisor to Pan Am, flew the S-40, the American Clipper, on its inaugural flight. Working together on this flight, Lindbergh and Sikorsky began to design a new plane that could possibly fly the Atlantic. In Sikorsky's own words,
"Every evening, the Lindbergh and I would sit nearby. We would take the menu and start writing specifications, sketches, and so forth of the transatlantic airplane."
The new seaplane was a Sikorsky S-42, a tremendous technical leap forward. Cruising speed was 150 miles per hour, powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney Hornet engines. It could accommodate 38 passengers, mail and cargo for a distance of 1,200 miles. Mail subsidies were essential for the success of any airline, and Pan Am relied heavily on these subsidies to maintain profitability. The first test flights of the S-42 were in March and April of 1934. Lindbergh was pleased with the initial performance of the S-42, and Pan Am ordered 10 of them at an initial price of $242,000 each. Lindbergh knew it was not a transatlantic aircraft. However, modified versions would prove extremely valuable in charting new routes for Pan Am. The British had refused to grant Pan Am landing rights necessary for transatlantic service. Now Pan Am focused its attention on the vast Pacific and the Orient. The S-42 also established 8 world records during its flight test program.
We just completed a very interesting flight. Captain Sergeyevsky, piloting our amphibian, established a new world record of altitude for amphibian. It was mighty cold up there, about 40 below zero. Much important and valuable information have been carried by myself and gathered, which will be useful for the future engineering work.
The S-42 performance was well suited for Pan Am's Caribbean and South American routes and flew there with distinction for many years. In April 1935, using a modified S-42, Pan Am's legendary Captain Musick began the first of a series of survey flights of Pan Am's Pacific bases. To meet its future plans for trans-Pacific flight, Pan Am now started training its captains and crews in navigation, meteorology, and Morse code necessary for crossing an ocean. At the same time Sikorsky was building the S-42, Pan Am signed a contract with the Glenn L. Martin Company of Baltimore, Maryland, to build 3 transoceanic seaplanes at a cost of $417,000 each. Primitive hull design tests were made by pulling a wooden model through the water. At that time, sophisticated testing facilities were not available for a plane that size. Martin engineers designed the M-130, one of the most beautiful planes ever built. It was capable of flying 3,000 miles with a few passengers or 4,000 miles with mail only. Its nomenclature, Martin 130, was derived for its wingspan, which was 130 feet long. The hull was made of aluminum alloy construction with 4 watertight bulkheads. It had corrugated bottom skin with smooth side skins. Passenger compartments were spacious, about 11 feet wide, with comfortable seats that converted into berths. These compartments were comfortably heated and soundproofed with adequate lighting. It also had 2 lavatories. The tail surfaces were monoplane, with a single fin and rudder. Because of the tail's height and enormous size of each wing, assembly took place outdoors. The wing consisted of a brace center section and 2 large cantilever outer panels. The bottom covering was smooth stress skin. The top covering was both corrugated panel and smooth sheet aluminum. Stiffeners were added to each wing to give extra strength. They needed to be large and strong to provide the necessary lift. The gross weight of the M130 was 51,000 pounds. Martin paid particular attention to the incorporation of superior maintenance features throughout the M130. Doors were provided in the wing panels, so a small man could squeeze inside for inspection and maintenance. It had 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines with constant speed propellers with speed brakes. Its service ceiling was 17,000 feet. Oil was carried in 4 tanks, 1 behind each engine's firewall. Fuel was carried in 2 auxiliary tanks installed in the wing center section and in tanks built into each C-wing structure. The C-wings were manually attached. They helped to produce lateral stability on the water and hold down sea spray. Each C-wing carried an additional 950 gallons of fuel. Although Martin claimed the M130 could carry up to 46 passengers, it could only cross the longest overwater portion, the San Francisco to Hawaii, with a maximum of 8 passengers, plus mail and cargo. The Martin M130 was one of the most beautiful planes ever built. It flew during the romantic period of the golden age of aviation. It was the plane that dreams of exotic international travel were built on for millions of people. Today, the Martin M130 is still one of the most widely acclaimed aircraft in the history of commercial aviation. Crossing the Pacific Ocean was an overwhelming challenge. To accomplish it, Pan Am had to build island bases on specks of islands in the middle of a 10,000-mile ocean. The longest leg of the crossing would be the 2,410-mile San Francisco to Hawaii. Next stop was another tiny island called Midway, which was 1,380 miles from Hawaii. Then 1,260 miles to Wake Island, 1,560 miles to Guam, and finally the last leg of the journey would be the 1,600 miles to Manila in the Philippine Islands. Pan Am temporarily used Macau as its mainland terminus. About a year later, the British granted landing rights for Hong Kong, and a permanent base was built there, 546 miles from Manila. In May of 1935, the steamship North Haven, with a 74-man construction crew and 44 technicians, started construction of 2 complete prefabricated 45-room hotels, one on Wake and the other on Midway Island. It required bringing ashore materials by barge in the pounding surf. It was both difficult and dangerous. Whole cities were built in addition to passenger accommodations for flight crews and permanent party personnel. This was no easy task. Heads had to be blasted out of the lagoons to prevent them from ripping out the bottoms of the seaplanes. In April 1935, using a modified S-42, Pan Am's legendary Captain Musick began the first of a series of survey flights of Pan Am's new Pacific bases. With First Officer Rod Sullivan, together they flew the modified S-42 from San Francisco to Hawaii in record-breaking time of 18 hours and 37 minutes. A temporary railroad was built to help haul materials on the islands, but most of the hundreds of 55-gallon drums of diesel fuel and aviation gas were unloaded and stacked by hand. The China Clipper was now ready to fly the inaugural mail route across the Pacific from San Francisco to Manila. Postmaster James Farley posed for pictures with Captain Musick and Sullivan. This was to be one of the most historic flights in aviation history. He gave Captain Musick a letter from President Roosevelt to the President of the Philippines. More than 125,000 people watched as the China Clipper rolled into the water, heavily laden with extra fuel. It was hard to control, and Musick had trouble getting it airborne. The San Francisco Bay Bridge under construction lay ahead. Musick couldn't fly over it as planned. He had no choice but to fly dangerously under it, between swaying cables. Once airborne, he flew through the California Golden Gate and on to Hawaii. Finally, after 17 long hours, the China Clipper landed in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Musick and his crew were presented with the traditional Hawaiian lei. After a short night's sleep, it was off to Midway, Wake, and Guam, and finally on November 29, 1935, it landed in Manila Bay. February 1936, Pan Am asked 4 aircraft companies to bid on a 4-engine aircraft capable of flying the Pacific. Douglas was too busy. Both Consolidated and Sikorsky's designs were rejected. Pan Am accepted Boeing's bid and granted a contract extension. The design was the brainchild of Wellwood Beale, who took the wings from the experimental XB-15 and added a large hull with double-deck construction. A contract was signed on July 31, 1936 for 6 Boeing Model 314 aircraft at a price of $618,908 each. Eddie Allen, Boeing's chief test pilot, is seen here monitoring the performance of the Wright R-2600 engines, the first commercial aircraft engines to use 100-octane fuel. B-314 was a mammoth of an airplane. It was 106 feet long, 28 feet high. Its wingspan was 152 feet. Gross weight was 82,000 pounds, with a range of 3,500 miles at a speed of 150 miles per hour. Was having trouble with this new giant, which delayed its introduction into service. All of the problems were minor, except the pilot didn't have complete rudder control. The plane also experienced severe porpoising when landing on water. After many test flights and fine-tuning, most of the problems were eventually corrected. Eddie Allen checked all modifications and improvements. He knew the 314 was a revolutionary aircraft. It was the Queen Mary of the skies. He wanted it to pass all of the rigid CAA tests with flying colors. Pan Am was losing $100,000 per month due to the prolonged introduction of the Boeing 314 into service. Little did Pan Am know that this was just the beginning of their problems. Two disasters struck in 1938. First, Captain Edwin Musick and a crew of 6 died when the S-42 blew up in midair off American Samoa. Second, a Martin M-130 disappeared after taking off from Guam. There were no survivors. But finally, on January 26, 1939, the Civil Aeronautics Authority granted Pan Am a certificate for commercial service. The Boeing 314 officially attained Pan Am's Clipper status. Sikorsky's rejected bid by Pan Am was the VS-44. 4 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R-1830 engines powered this plane. The wingspan was 124 feet and the overall length was 79 feet. Its cruising speed was 160 miles per hour. It weighed 57,500 pounds. It had the combined look of the Sikorsky 42 and the Martin M130. The VS-44 had a maximum range on long flights of 3,800 miles with accommodations for 16 or 42 passengers on short flights. When not carrying passengers with modified fuel tanks, it would serve as an oceanic transport. Although the Sikorsky VS-44 was rejected by Pan Am, Sikorsky went on to produce plans for a new flying boat capable of flying 5,000 miles non-stop. The AX-224 and the AX-225 were going to be 6-engine aircraft that could accommodate Pan Am's requirements for a transoceanic aircraft. Again, Pan Am's president Juan Trippe passed. His great insight told him that new and innovative designs such as Boeing's Stratoliner, Douglas's DC-4E, and the Lockheed Constellation were going to change the world of air travel forever. He was right. They did. The VS-44 seen here flew with Avalon Air Transport as a shuttle for the 12-mile trip from Long Beach Harbor to Catalina Island. It was Sikorsky's last commercial seaplane. Pan Am wasted no time in familiarizing its crews to fly the 314. The 314 carried a large crew compared to today's aircraft. Since the flight from San Francisco to Hawaii took nearly 24 hours, 2 crews, 16 crew members were needed. The crew's quarters and flight deck were unbelievably large. The flight crew consisted of a captain, first pilot and second pilot, navigator, flight engineer, and radio operator. Stewards, who are all male, cared for the passengers' needs. The radio operator remained in contact with Pan Am's Pacific headquarters, relaying weather and position information. Passenger quarters were decorated in Pan Am blue, and it was all first class, the only class. Opulent luxury abounded. There were 5 spacious, beautiful lounges, an elegant dining room, and luxurious Pullman-style berths for sleeping, and a deluxe honeymoon suite. It was a sea-going 5-star hotel in the air. In January 1939, the Golden Gate International Exposition opened on Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay. At the same time, Pan Am moved from Alameda to new facilities on Treasure Island. Pan Am was now ready to begin flying its new Boeing 314s across the Pacific. With its new facilities at Treasure Island, it had lots of room to service engines, propellers, and other parts of the giant new clipper ships that were soon to begin the final leg of its Pacific conquest. Weather was always a constant problem flying the Pacific, and study of meteorology was in its infancy. Reliable weather maps of the Pacific were non-existent, and Pan Am had to continually update its weather maps so pilots could avoid turbulent weather and strong headwinds. Most of the weather forecasts came from Pan Am's Pacific Island bases, the United States Navy, and Matson liners at sea. The Boeing 314 was not pressurized and therefore could not fly over the weather. Captains selected a route that gave them the best weather, fuel consumption, and operational safety. Safety was always prime concern for Pan Am. Captains had to be sure of their airspeed and fuel consumption before reaching a point of no return. No matter how carefully planned, the Martin M130s and Boeing 314s occasionally had to return to San Francisco because of strong westerly headwinds. The first passenger flight from San Francisco using a Boeing 314 was in February 1939. From then on, Boeing 314 flights were on a weekly basis. Passengers arrived at the Treasure Island terminal by Pan Am limousine. A round-trip flight cost about $900, close to $10,000 in today's dollars. They were usually rich, socially prominent. Sometimes they were movie stars or royalty. All passenger luggage was carefully weighed and tagged. Passengers were assigned seats, but since every passenger flew first class, the only class, there wasn't a bad seat anywhere on the luxurious Boeing 314. The Treasure Island terminal was well staffed to provide first-class service to all passengers. At precisely 3 p.m., the flight crew, dressed in their neatly tailored blue uniforms with white hats, similar to the United States Navy, marched to their clipper, ready for departure. Next came the passengers, led by a member of the station's staff. As usual, thousands of people came to see the Clipper's departure. The general public now called any Pan Am plane that flew the Pacific a China Clipper. Slowly, the giant Clipper taxied out into the Berkeley Bay, preceded by a Pan Am launch that scoured 3 miles of the bay for any foreign objects that could damage the Clipper's hull. The trans-Pacific journey had begun. First stop, Hawaii. Once airborne, stewards passed out newspapers and magazines to the passengers. The food on all Pan Am clippers was freshly cooked and prepared in flight. It was five-star dining at its best, from entrees to desserts, served on beautiful bone china with crystal glasses and sterling flatware, all placed on elegant Irish linens with the best of wines. Printed menus were prepared along with vased flowers. The food and service was always magnificent. Before bedtime, passengers could prepare themselves, while stewards arranged the Pullman-style upper and lower berths for their sleeping pleasure. While the passengers slept, the ever-vigilant Pan Am flight crew worked throughout the night. Weather reports were constantly relayed to the flight crew from island bases and ships at sea. Airspeed, fuel consumption, and existing headwinds were regularly checked to determine flight times, positions, and estimated times of arrival. Contact on a predetermined schedule with both Treasure Island, Matson Liners, and Hawaii was maintained by the radio operator on this leg of the flight. He continually relayed weather changes to the flight crew. The flight engineer constantly monitored the engine gauges and, when necessary, uses a catwalk inside of each wing to check individual engine performance. Minor maintenance could be performed on any engine from inside the wing. Continually checking his position, the navigator monitored the route to Hawaii to be sure they were on course. He used, when necessary, celestial navigation to accurately get position fixes. Pan Am pioneered radio navigation and used it extensively to assist navigators in plotting positions and confirming direction headings throughout the Pacific. Without it, locating a small island in the Pacific would almost be an impossible task. It was one of their secrets to success. Pan Am left nothing to chance. Passenger safety was its #1 priority. At dawn, the breathtaking island of Oahu appears, and the clipper lands and taxis to Pearl City. Passengers deplane and walk up the ramp to a beautiful island paradise. They were given the traditional Hawaiian greeting, aloha, and a beautiful flower lei. Then they were taken by limousine to the magnificent Royal Hawaiian Hotel. traveling on, it was just a brief stopover in paradise. Regardless, all passengers had some time to swim, catch some big waves on a surfboard, perhaps ride in an outrigger canoe, or just sunbathe on beautiful Waikiki Beach. There was something to do for everybody, including shopping and touring the beautiful island of Oahu, to looking at the unseen wonders of the world. Because of the limited accessibility of the Hawaiian Islands at that time, nature was still at its best. For others, no trip to Hawaii would be complete without going to the irresistible pineapple fields. As outbound passengers slept at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, the Clipper was refueled. Outgoing mail and provisions for the flight and island bases were stored aboard. Now off to Midway Island. Midway Island is 1,384 miles from Hawaii, the first small island on the Clipper's westerly flight across the Pacific. Once the Clipper landed, passengers were taken from the dock and transported in station wagons to Pan Am's hotel. Each room was lovely with a comfortable bed, private shower and bathroom facilities, with plenty of hot and cold running water. And of course, for each Clipper passenger, great food and drinks awaited them. Picking up unique glass floats from Japanese fishing nets was an interesting activity for some Clipper passengers. viewers enjoyed looking at the zany antics of the more than 150,000 Goonie birds on Midway Island. There was no end to activities on Midway Island, from sand golf, swimming, sunbathing, or just fun on the beach. Just before dinner, perhaps a cocktail, maybe a cigarette, and then dinner. Impeccable service in the air and on the ground were a Pan Am tradition. Elegantly dressed in starched white uniforms, chamorros from Guam did an excellent job serving passengers in the dining room. After a gourmet meal, perhaps dancing to swing music, a nightcap, or a relaxing game of gin rummy. Lights out. Tomorrow we're off to Wake Island. Wake Island is 1,285 miles from Midway. It's a small dot in the middle of 10,000 miles of ocean. But with the aid of Pan Am's radio direction finding equipment, outstanding pilots and navigators, it's just another stopover in the vast Pacific Ocean. The hotel on Wake Island was built by Pan Am. It was exactly the same as the one on Midway Island. It's obvious that the Pan Am construction crew not only built a beautiful hotel, they helped create an island paradise. The greetings, service, and hospitality made each guest feel absolutely welcome. As always, there were lots of activities, depending on each passenger's desires. There was sailing, snorkeling, and thousands of exotic sea life to look at in the shallow lagoons. next stop on the Pacific journey was the island of Guam, 1,506 miles from Wake Island. Pan Am's base at Guam was in the village of Sume, near Apra Harbor, about 6 miles from Agana, the capital of Guam. Pan Am used a beautifully remodeled military facility as its hotel. As usual, it had all the amenities. At their leisure, passengers could roam the island and enjoy many of the native activities and traditions, or enjoy the sheer magnificence of the island. Natives were always willing to show off their skill and agility by climbing tall coconut trees that surrounded the island. After a restful night's sleep, off early the next morning for Manila, capital of the Philippine Islands. Manila is 1,600 miles from Guam. The Clipper is now closing in on the final leg of Pan Am's Pacific conquest. Pan Am's Clipper base in the Philippine Islands was at the old U.S. Marine Corps flying base at Cavite, about 8 miles south of the capital of Manila. Passengers stayed at the luxurious Manila Hotel. As usual, there was plenty for passengers to see in and around Manila, from floating cities to exotic foods and a fascinating culture that existed unspoiled for centuries. Now the final leg of Pan Am's Pacific conquest, Hong Kong, the gateway to the Orient. Hong Kong is 546 miles from Manila. The Clipper's Hong Kong base was at Kai Tak, located on the Kowloon side of Victoria Harbor. This was the front door to China. Hong Kong, a British Crown colony, was the business mecca of the Orient. It's where Pan Am passengers first saw the traditions and customs of one of the world's oldest civilizations. Kai Tak Airport, Pan Am's independent subsidiary, China National Aviation Corporation, called CNAC, landed its planes to transfer passengers and mail from the Clipper's return flight. Scheduled British Airways flights also transferred passengers and mail to Pan Am. Pan Am quickly began to expand its Pacific routes as more Boeing 314s and newly trained crews became available. As an intermediate stop for its passengers and mail routes to New Zealand, Pan Am selected Canton Island and Noumea on the island of New Caledonia. In addition, new flights were started from Los Angeles to Honolulu, and in May of 1941, Singapore was added, with Australia soon to follow. Pan Am now basked in the warm glow of its triumph. Clippers flew regular and profitable flights throughout the Pacific. A dream had come true. A conquest completed. It all came to an abrupt end on December 7th, 1941. The world was now at war. On that fateful day, the beautiful blue and white of the beloved Pan Am pioneering flag turned to America's red, white, and blue. Its new flag was Old Glory. Pan Am Clipper captains talked about their narrow escapes from the attacks on Pacific Island bases. Japanese fighters destroyed one Clipper in the water at Hong Kong and damaged another at Wake Island. Pan Am crews were well trained. They had sealed orders that told them what to do if war came. The beautiful shiny Clippers were painted a dull navy gray. Nothing was left to chance. Pan Am facilities throughout the United States began to train Army and Navy flight crews. They trained flight engineers in the operation of multi-engined aircraft. Pan Am had the only trained navigators prior to World War II. Their skills at ocean flying were unsurpassed. The Navy and Air Force desperately needed this essential training, and Pan Am instructors delivered the best. Teaching radio communications to Army and Navy flight crews was also part of Pan Am's training program. As the tide of events quickly changed after December 7, 1941, Pan Am had completed its conquest of the Pacific and made aviation history. But sadly, when Pan Am's beautiful silver ladies were painted a dull gray, the era of the Clippers and the golden age of aviation came to an end in America.